Hey folks, Doug here. Before this episode really gets rolling, I just wanted to mention one thing about it. A lot of times people come to me and they're like, Doug, you're so eloquent when you talk. Everything is so wonderful. Your show sounds so great. And you're just one of those people that's really easy to listen to. And for the most part, I say, sure, but I also do a lot of editing on my shows. So I wanted to show people what unedited Doug sounds like. And normally, I'm pretty good for the most part. Normally, when I have guests on the show, I can be quite eloquent and I'll think before I talk, and everything will go pretty good. I don't have to do very much editing on my own account. But every once in a while, I will have somebody on the show that completely throws me off my A game. Not in a bad way. It's just sometimes I fanboy out a little bit too much and just get completely thrown off. And this episode is one such instance of this. So what you're going to hear is unfiltered Doug with all of his tongue-tiedness, all of his slip-ups, and just his general goofiness for the most part left intact. But I thought before I really trimmed this episode and really edited it, that I'd be losing something, and perhaps I'd be losing a bit of enthusiasm, perhaps, because I think one of the things that makes magic so special is the person who's relating it to you, their enthusiasm. So I'd love, as a bit of a treat, or a bit of an experiment, if you will, to leave Doug unedited for this one. Buckle up, here we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to What Magic Is This Podcast, a podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and every once in a while, you have to do a little bit of a show for yourself. And seeing as how 3 days ago it was my birthday, this is, in some way, a birthday episode for me that I hope you all enjoy. So let us flash back to the year of 2004. I, Douglas, am working at a video store in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And I am about to put stickers on all of the new released DVDs, and those are digital video discs for people that don't know, back in the day, about to be released. And at one point, I come across a DVD called Disinformation. And on the cover of this DVD is a very cool looking dude holding a cigarette in his fingers, looking kind of spooky, looking kind of debonair. And for some reason, this DVD stuck with me because it reminded me of a website that I used to go to called Disinformation. And then I looked at the cover a little bit closer and I saw this little figure of a devil, kind of like a devil smiling. I was like, wait a second, I think this has something to do with that website. So luckily, the DVD didn't have to be released for about 3 more days. So I took this DVD home with me and I, that night, watched it in its entirety. Now, it was a 4-part television series about all kinds of crazy things, including one about Satanism that is well worth watching for everybody. It is fantastic. I really loved this TV show. Apparently, it kicked up some dust. It was a to-do. But the second disc on this DVD was called Disinfo. And something made me want to watch it. So I put it in my DVD player and I started watching. And one of the first things that I saw was this somewhat loud, crazy Scotsman who begins his speech by screaming into the microphone. And then he started talking about how if you take sentences and take letters out of the sentence and do these strange things, that you can change reality. And then that night I went to sleep and had the craziest dreams I've ever had in my entire life. It changed something in me. And I held onto that DVD and continued to watch the rest of this second disc. And as I went through, there was, at the very end of this DVD, a gentleman by the name of Robert Anton Wilson, who that crazy Scottish person had mentioned in his talk. So I was like, I should probably watch this guy. And then I did. And that person also made me have crazy dreams that night. In fact, those dreams continued for the next week. And it made me think that there is something really to all of the things that the people on this DVD are talking about. Now, flash forward to about 2 months ago in 2024, I get an email from somebody who basically says, "Hey, Doug, I'm wondering if I could introduce you to this gentleman by the name of Richard Metzger." And I said, "Oh my goodness, I know who that is. That's that really cool looking guy holding a cigarette on the DVD cover to Disinformation. Of course, I know who Richard Metzger is." And they said, "You know what? Richard's got something coming up. He wants to talk to you on your podcast." And at one point, I was like, do I want this person, this person on the DVD cover? Do I want them to remain a mythological figure in my mind? Somebody who has influenced me to an enormous degree? Because truly, if I hadn't watched that second disc of the Disinformation DVD, this podcast would not exist. All of the books behind me would not be there. Nothing in my life would be the same. Did I want Richard Metzger to remain a figure that I will never, ever talk to? And I thought, no. It's your birthday coming up. It's time for you to talk to Richard. So for this one, I would love to welcome to What Magic Is This I would love to welcome to What Magic Is This podcast, a jack of all trades, a founder of the enormously influential disinformation website all the way back in 1996, as well as the host of the Channel 4 the TV series Disinformation. He has edited a couple of books, including Book of Lies, The Disinformation Guide to Magic and the Occult. And since 2009, he has been the driving force behind the music and counterculture website dangerousminds.net. We are beyond delighted to finally welcome to What Magic Is This podcast, counterculture, éminence, grise, celebrity baker, Rastafarian Maoist, and Pynchonesque attorney, Richard Metzger. Richard, thank you for hanging in there for this very long introduction, the longest I've ever given. Welcome to What Magic Is This?
Thank you. I hope I live up to that introduction.
It's been a long, strange trip, Richard. 2004. Yeah, that DVD. Are you aware at how much that DVD specifically has influenced people? So many people I talk to are be like, "Oh, that's point zero for me. That made me what I am."
To be honest, I did not know that until this summer.
Okay.
And when I was doing the Kickstarter, I was told that story by so many people on their podcast or, in person or over email. And so, yes, now, yes, I'm aware of that now. And it's a strange feeling.
Yeah.
I know that I mean, I love it. It's wonderful. It's so flattering,
It was that 1-2 punch.
It means it wasn't all in vain also.
Right. It was that 1-2 punch though, Richard, where I got that DVD, and then next thing I know is like, oh, there's a book coming out also that has that Scottish guy. For everybody that's wondering, that Scottish guy is Grant Morrison, the comic book author and just amazing person that also has a chapter, the beginning of this book called Book of Lies, which has got so many crazy and wonderful figures talking about magic and the occult. It was the 1-2 punch. It just like you changed lives. My life, I don't want to continue to sound hyperbolic and overly enthusiastic. It changed everything. Beforehand, I was just like a dabbler in, I'd read Crowley and Wilson and I'd get those books, Reader's Digest, the Unexplained and things like that. But it was not until I heard Grant and Robert Anton Wilson talking that I was like, this is it. This is what my life is going to be for the rest of my life now.
Well, you know what? I have to say that the goal in putting Book of Lies together, for instance, was to reach younger people, people younger than myself, like and to have so they could have the same experience that I had, reading Crowley or Bob Wilson's books, or this kind of thing when I was younger. Genesis Peorage,
right? Yeah. Oh, it was such a fantastic period of time, and it's one that I look back so fondly. So, yes. 2 months ago, somebody was like, "Doug, do you want to talk to Richard?" I was like, "Okay, I have to." Okay, I don't know if I'm ready. I'm probably going to I'm going to say embarrassing things as soon as he comes on Zoom, and it happened. Sorry, everybody, it really did happen. But I started thinking, like, okay, I've got Richard on the show. What the hell do we talk about? What am I going to talk to this guy about? And I thought about it, and it's like I gave Richard a couple of things, but the one I really wanted to talk to Richard about was this guy that ended that disinfo con day. There was 12 hours that happened back in 2000. This event, and it has sent ripples through since then. That before Bob even walks out on the stage, and he was pretty frail at that point because he was still suffering from post polio. You said ready to pull the cosmic trigger. Robert Anton Wilson, and the crowd went crazy, and just the things that he talked about blew my mind. So it's like I have to have Richard on to talk about Bob, because for my podcast, I've been doing this for over 5 years. Robert Anton Wilson was my 6th episode. I've got over 150 of these things. And I think it's time that the podcast just goes back to a little bit of the roots of what magic is this, to talk about Robert Anton Wilson. So I'd love to ask you, how did you first find the work of Pope Bob?
It would have been the Illuminatus trilogy when I was like in my early teens. The kids who were older than I was, who I hung around with, read it. There were 3 volumes back then, so it was like a paperback, it was like Dell paperback or something like this. So it was something that you could buy at a mall.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, but that was my introduction to Bob's writing, was through the Illuminatus trilogy. Yeah.
Did you rush out to grab anything else by him, or was there anything else as available, or not really? Or
well, the answer to that is that I didn't, and for the reason that it wasn't available, and in a pre-internet age, I didn't know what else he had written. And the thing was, he was like someone who was mysterious. It wasn't like you're going to read about him in People magazine.
Right.
You know what I mean? So you don't know much more about him at that point in history than what was on the back of the book.
Right.
Right. Which is next to nothing. So I didn't actually take a deep dive into Bob's work until about 1994.
Wow. Okay. Nice.
1994. That's when I didn't read The Cosmic Trigger until I was 20. I read it when I was 28.
Wow.
20, right. And at a time when a lot of really crazy shit was happening to me. So it was like the most fortuitous time in my life, and I possibly could have discovered that book. I discovered that book.
Awesome. That's so great. And let's talk about how eventually you got to meet Robert Anton Wilson. How did that come about?
Well, I met him before I really started reading his book, to tell you the truth.
Really? That's awesome.
Yeah. There was an event in Hollywood called the Millennial Madness, right? And it was meant to be like a yearly thing that they were going to do to count down to the millennium. And it was hosted by Roy of Hollywood, who was the night DJ on KPFK radio. And so the headliner was Tim Leary, and that's who I went to see. And then it was Bob, and I thought, oh, that'll be great to see him too. But I didn't know that much about him. And then Paul Krasner and somebody else. I can't remember. There were some other people on the bill as well, but it was like a day-long event. It was in a Unitarian church on Wilshire, and Bob was outside smoking a cigarette, and I went outside to smoke some weed, and I asked him if he wanted to join me, and he said, "Oh yeah." And so that's how that was like how the first time that I ever talked to him was then. And then the second time that I met him was at the Phoenix bookstore in Santa Monica, when he did sort of an appearance there. It was like in a room with maybe about 30 people present.
Yeah.
Maybe talk. And then so he was smoking a cigarette in the parking lot, and I had a joint. I said, "Hey, do you want to smoke a joint?" He said, "Oh yeah." So, once again, it was that marijuana that brings people together.
Absolutely. And there were several points. You had him for DisinfoCon, but you also there exists interviews that you have done with him through the age. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you sat down and talked with him at least 3 times, one-on-one, or
recording it. Yeah.
Yeah.
The first time I was doing a show on an internet network called pseudo.com. And it started off as like a radio station, online radio station. Then it became like an online, video thing. So you could watch my talk show, which is called The Infinity Factory, on this like postage stamp size flickery reel player, as they called it back then. But this is in the 90s. This is in the late 90s. And so, while it was still a radio station, I thought, one of the first people I want to talk to was Bob. And so I contacted him through his website, and I duly sat down and wrote out, probably in longhand, about 30 pages of questions that I wanted to ask him. But almost all of them, not almost all, but like 70% of the questions or more, were probably devoted to the starseed transmissions, which I was really fascinated about, right? And it was, and it was really obvious after like the first 10, they had commercial breaks, right? It was really obvious after the first segment of the show that he didn't really want to talk about
Right.
this, right? And so I'm panicking, right? So I'm, I don't want to be embarrassed in front of him, or it's a live audience as well. So I don't, and so I between the commercial breaks, I'm saying like, "Oh, Bob, this is what I've got," like, and he's like, "It doesn't seem like this is something you want to talk about." And he said something that I thought was really interesting. He said, "I don't." He's like, "Well, he's like, I wrote that a long time ago. You're asking me about something I wrote 20 years ago, and I may have changed my mind about certain of these topics since then, but I don't want to like shit on that, and like, because I would prefer that my readers go through that same experience that I did themselves."
Right.
Like, oh, I mean, that's a profound thing for him to say, I thought, but yeah, but that was the second time. And sorry, that was the first time I interviewed him. And then the second time was also on Pseudo. And that time he was present. He had come into New York. I think that must have been 97. And he was doing a talk at the Korzybski Society.
Cool.
Right? I think it was at the Harvard Club, maybe. And I saw that talk. It was that later that night. But anyways, Bob came into town and basically like came from Newark Airport directly to Pseudo, where Genesis Peorge and I sat down and got to interview him for 2 hours.
Awesome.
Right. And then Jen, Doug Rushkoff, Parker Posey, and myself went to see him speak that night.
Nice.
And then after that, I interviewed him for the Channel 4 show, which is not on the DVD, but it aired on Channel 4. And that was a half-hour show that was basically just devoted to Bob.
Yeah. Incredible. Bob was such an enormous figure in my life. Once I found him, I've mentioned on my podcast before that I read literally every single thing that he's written or that was put into print. Almost, I would try to find old interviews that he would do in magazines because he loved doing magazine interviews, particularly with High Times because it's Bob, right? And
yeah,
in a period of time in my life where early 20s, I wasn't making a lot of friends. Bob really did seem like a friend. And at one point, it was maybe 2005 or 2006. There was a website called boingboing.net. I believe they're still around. And they did this thing called Robert Anton Wilson Week. And a lot of people came and talked about Bob on there. Doug Rushkoff did something. And then you did a small article about them called Wilson and I. And it sticks in my memory, Richard, because, and I hope this isn't too embarrassing for you, because I felt like Bob was such a friend to me. And in your article, you kind of make Bob sound like he was a bit of a cranky guy who drinks and smokes too much. And for some reason,
oh no,
I was angry at you. I was angry, and it was but it's so embarrassing to think this. That I was angry at this person I've never met for making Bob seem human.
Well, no, that wasn't my intention, anyways. But no, he could. I mean, like a lot of old guys, he could be cranky. You know what I mean? And I was friends with, who Brother Theodore was.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, so I was friends with Theodore, right? And he was 93. I mean, I think he was 94 when he died. But he was, so I'm at his place, hanging out with him. So Theodore could be very cranky. You know what I mean? So I was kind of like used to that. And so with Bob, he had the post-polio situation. So, so there was at times that he would have a short, just a short fuse about stuff. You know what I mean? There was one time, I have to say this, I was telling this to Gabriel Kennedy for his book, but for the DisinfoCon, this is a story. It doesn't make me look great, but I didn't have anything to do with it either. So, but when there was a woman who was working as the assistant on that, and she thought, oh, this is New York. You just get a cab and so she had sent all the information to him, and he thought there was going to be somebody coming to pick him up in a car, and she didn't know, and nor did I know that he was in a wheelchair at that point. Oh. Right. So he just went and he stayed in a motel that was near the airport. And he called me it was like 11:30 at night. And he called me up and just was like really, really pissed off at me. This is literally like the evening before the DisinfoCon, and then he realized that, I didn't have anything to do with it and I had no idea that this was happening. And then he very quickly cooled off and we were like, good. But, but that did happen. I mean, but no, what I was trying to get across in that article was that there was a point where he asked me, do I come across as cranky?
Right.
And the answer would have, if I, in truth, would have been, well, a little bit, yeah, But I said, oh no, not at all. And he's like, oh, good, that's a relief. I don't want to be one of those old guys, But I'm sorry that you took that away from it, because what I meant to get across was how wonderful it was to be with him and how real he was. Now, he was a normal guy. You know what I mean? He was a normal guy that you could sit down and have a conversation with. You could smoke a joint with him and have a good conversation. And he was wonderful. And, they always say, don't meet your heroes. But the person who said that had never met Bob Wilson.
That's what I hear from everybody. They said everybody else I've met, I think even Douglas Rushkoff talked about this at one point.
Doug and I have talked about it ourselves. It's true.
Bob just was like a really cool, down to earth, first generation immigrant, kind of just like he salted the earth in so many ways. And I never got the chance to meet him, obviously. But I felt like through his writings and through my familiarity with his writings, I actually knew Bob in some way. And it's just wonderful that I'm able to talk to somebody that knew Bob as much as you did, Richard. And yeah, I that whole thing of me being angry, that is embarrassing. That's just like, because that is me doing the thing that Bob didn't want people doing with Bob, which was deifying him, making him into the saying he doesn't want you to do that. And
no, not at all. I think it would have made him uncomfortable to be
deified. Right. Oh my goodness. But that's truly.
That's the thing is, he wanted to meet people on a hey, how are you kind of level. He did not want to, to come up, be someone's hero guru. He wanted to meet people on their level.
Right. Absolutely.
He was a normal guy, super friendly, super sweet, super intelligent.
Definitely. Oh my goodness. Well, we've done a lot of talking about your experience with Bob and whatnot, but let's talk about Bob and his contribution to this thing that we love, like magic, the occult, the weirdness, and all the things. Because while I have done an episode, I think there are some things in that episode. As I said, it was my 6th episode. It's less than an hour. I barely had time to really get into the nitty gritty of Bob's influences and his influence. So let's do that here. So for folks who grab, say, one of the big 3 books, that's going to be Illuminatus or Prometheus Rising or Cosmic Trigger, they'll notice that this figure by the name of Timothy Leary comes up. And I haven't really done a lot of talking about Timothy Leary on my podcast. So for yourself, for myself, Timothy Leary is a name that is very familiar. For folks that were born, say, after 1997, 98, Tim Leary is mainly, to most people, that LSD guy, or they just don't know who he is at all. So I have to ask you, if you could, for my listeners, who was Timothy Leary?
Well, in my opinion, I think Leary was one of the pivotal intellects of the 20th century. He was certainly one of the pivotal characters in the counterculture of the 1960s, and into the 90s, when he was sort of into cyberculture and stuff like that. But he lived one of the most outsized and sort of heroic lives of any sort of philosopher, that you can name throughout history. How many intellectuals have escaped from prison? You know what I mean? And been on the lam from the law, and been called the most wanted, the most dangerous man in America by the president of the United States and the head of the FBI. So he was many people. And but if you look at Leary's influence, one of the things that I find quite odd, and I've seen this happen a few times, Leary was somebody that was always in the news, in the media, etc., until he died, and then you never really heard about him after that. It was just and the same thing had happened with Buckminster Fuller. I'd noticed that when Fuller died. When I was a kid, Buckminster Fuller and Einstein were the 2 geniuses, and then after Fuller died, you didn't hear about him again, and so that I've noticed that does seem to happen in our culture a lot, where people are forgotten. But the thing about Leary is, I don't think that I think he'll be rediscovered. There'll probably be a movie about his life, that kind of thing. It's obviously, it should have happened a long time ago. It's ridiculous that it hasn't happened yet. But I think that what has to was for someone like him to be truly appreciated and for people to understand what was this guy's real influence, I think it takes a matter of decades away from, there's going to have to be a lot of distance from that time period, because some future historian is going to look at his influence differently than someone who goes, oh yeah, that LSD guy, and they're going to see somebody who came in as almost kind of with a religious fervor, if not a religious aptitude, right, to spread the word of psychedelics and and instantly sort of supercharging the giving people cosmic consciousness, shall we say, the gift of cosmic consciousness. And if you look at the time period where Leary sort of hits in the culture, it's exactly at the moment where television goes from black and white to Batman, and the monkeys, and then so this is a guy who, what would the music of would the psychedelic music that was made in the late 1960s have ever happened without Timothy Leary? I mean, it's questionable, and when you think about the fact that like the Moody Blues wrote a song about him. I mean, these people were highly aware of who he was. They wanted to meet him. He wanted to meet them, obviously. But I mean, this was a guy who had kind of like, he was a figure that was revered in sort of rock. He was a rock star amongst rock stars in that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I say, I think that it will take decades away from that event for people to really realize, like, oh shit, if it wasn't for this guy, turning on literally millions of people, when you think about it, how many things wouldn't have happened? You know what I mean? So if you could go back in time and kill Leary's grandfather and he never happened, you see what I'm saying? Now you start to realize, oh, maybe he was really influential.
Yeah, his influence. There was a period of time after he passed away, and I remember being somewhat informed about almost every aspect where they really tried to make him seem like a bad person. Like a lot of articles were released about him being a bad father and things like this. And and that has kind of died off. That has kind of burned off now. And I think people are really starting to see, like, wow. For those folks who don't know, he was a clinically trained psychiatrist for, I believe, Harvard, a major Ivy League school, who was instrumental in instrumenting a kind of personality tests for people that later got used in things like Myers-Briggs tests. And yes, he started experimenting with psilocybin, mushrooms, and recidivism, and people that were prisoners. And then eventually, yes, LSD became part of one of the things that he was somewhat fixated in. I would argue that Ken Casey's probably a little bit more about the actual spreading of LSD use amongst people, but he was the one that put kind of like an official face on the use of psychedelics. Like he was so this guy from Harvard, he knows what he's talking about, and he thinks that it's a very important thing.
He was speaking to Congress.
Yeah.
He was that guy.
That's right. And there's a really wonderful book by John Higgs called "I Have America Surrounded." For folks, this is the book to grab to really get your head around, like, how important. There's a lot of biographies about Tim Leary. I've read 2 or 3 of them. This is the one where it's like, I see why this guy is as influential as he is. You said that you had a chance to hang out with Tim, or at least meet him. What was he like?
I think Leary was a complicated character.
Yeah.
You mentioned something, people saying he was a bad father or something like this. Like around the time that he died, he did get a lot of bad press. A lot of that was related to something that had appeared on the smokinggun.com website. They published, as it were, dossiers, and they would usually publish like an FBI file on someone.
Right.
And so the 2 guys who did that site were 2 Village Voice journalists, right? And if you looked at this material that the FBI had put together about Leary, you could, as they did, come to the conclusion, oh, this guy was rated, he was singing to the feds,
Yeah.
Except that he wasn't. He was, how many people, I mean, here's the thing, right? When he was going to get out, and he had to go and make nice and talk to the FBI and act as if he was giving them information, he didn't know anything. And you see that in the transcript over and over again. He's saying, like, I'm not sure if that's the place. Like they're asking him, like, where was the Weathermen's safe house? Right? The Weathermen's safe. Who cares? Somebody else was living there by that time. They're just going to like have a safe house, and they're still going to be there 4 or 5 years later. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You know what I'm saying? But I just don't think that the subtleties of that, right, those guys didn't pick up on that. So, but if you looked also at what was happening sort of at the time, the counterculture was very divided by Leary in about 1974, 75. It was like, oh, like, he's gonna, he's gonna speak to the FBI. It was like there was, so there was like a big clash about that, and some people took his side, some people didn't. Allen Ginsberg was someone who was for Leary,
Right. Right.
whereas others were less excited about Leary. He was a controversial guy. But you ask about hanging out with him. Um, you know, uh, I mean, I met him several times
Okay.
briefly over the years. You know what I mean? And then and then one time I got to like really sit down and talk to him at his house. And but uh, that day, well, that was an interesting day to be there. I'll tell you what, because there was a guy there. He's now dead, but a wonderful guy named Michael Daly, I think was his name. And he was a rare antiquarian book dealer in Los Angeles. He dealt with all the counterculture stuff. And he was there. The FBI had given back all of these boxes of stuff that they had confiscated from Leary's house during a raid, right? And amongst that stuff was like a thing of flour. Like it was still like, had like grub worms in it. It just been, but it was like literally like flour. They thought, oh, maybe this is cocaine.
Okay.
They took everything, but they returned that to him, like 30 years later.
Here you go.
Here it is. So there was all of this kind of stuff. And so that stuff was being cataloged the day that I was there. So there were all these boxes out on the patio. And I got there at the appointed time. And I think Leary showed up about 90 minutes late. And I knew he was going to show up eventually because it was his house. So I just sat there and waited. And but that day, that was like, I think that was a Friday. And on the Monday was when he was announcing that he was going to die and he was going to die in public and all that kind of stuff. So at that time, so he was wearing like white cotton gloves because his hands were so, he had so much cancer and stuff in his hands. So, and he was fairly out of it. But there was one point where I asked him something where he really, well, there were 2 points during the conversation where he sort of like sort of snapped to attention, I guess you would sort of say it, and like fixed his eyes on me and told me what was up. But at one point, I asked him what he thought about Terence McKenna.
Oh,
right,
cool. Right.
And he goes, Terence McKenna's a high Episcopalian.
Well,
yeah, I mean, and I thought about that, and I was like, I mean, I instantly realized he was right.
Right.
And for anybody who's listening to this, going like, what he meant was that this end of the world stuff that McKenna was always on about, the time wave zero. He was like, that to him was just Christian eschatology, but he had found a new way to express that for himself.
Yeah.
Because he couldn't shake his Catholic imprinting, basically.
Right.
But Terence McKenna's a high Episcopalian. And then the other thing is when I said to him, like, well, Tim, one thing that I really wanted to make sure that I had a chance to ask you about in person was the starseed transmissions. And that was what he just shut the conversation down. It was like, don't want to talk about that.
Really?
Yeah.
So bizarre that, yeah.
Well, he might look at it and go, maybe. I mean, it seemed to me that he must have been embarrassed by it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Retrospect,
For folks that don't know, the Starseed Transmissions was a period of time when Timothy Leary was in prison, and he was trying to activate for himself a way of reaching some kind of higher being while in jail, and he believed that he did, and a lot of things that we're going to talk about in a little bit here came from this period of time while he was in prison, really trying to meet his higher self, or what he believed was some kind of like a higher entity or a higher being. But yeah, it's bizarre that you mentioned that Bob didn't want to talk about his kind of weird stuff, and we'll talk about it in a little bit later. But yeah,
well, no, Bob would have talked about his own weird stuff. It was the Leary stuff in particular that he wasn't interested.
He wasn't interested in talking about Leary's. Yeah. Okay.
It was the starseed transmission. That's what because that's what I wanted to talk about.
Right.
I wanted to talk about it with both of them.
Yeah.
And both of them kind of like shut it down. Like, nah, let's
yeah, whippersnappers. My goodness.
Yes.
So again, for those people that grab any of Bob's books, but particularly Illuminatus, Prometheus Rising, and Cosmic Trigger, Bob does a lot of talking about Timothy Leary. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think Leary's influence on Bob specifically was? We've talked about his worldwide and cultural influence, but what was Bob's influence via Tim Leary? Because Cosmic Trigger, even at the time when I read it, which I loved it, one of the things that I was kind of like, he does this a lot. He just keeps talking about Tim Leary. in this kind of, he makes him out to be a saint. He really spends a good eighth of the book talking about Tim Leary. So, but what do you think? Why do you think why do you think that Bob was so influenced by Tim?
Well, Leary was an extremely prominent person,
Right.
the 60s. And Bob, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think that Bob interviewed Tim for The Realist,
He
for
did.
Paul Krasner's.
Krasner sent him down in '64. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's how they first met. So, Bob would have been approaching him as an interested journalist and somebody who was perhaps hoping to hear some words of wisdom, from this guy who was being, received in the culture as a kind of a guru. But but the thing about it is, Leary's intellectual. I think Leary's influence on Bob Wilson is intellectual, and the intellectual side of Leary doesn't. Aside from some of the books that he wrote about psychology in the late 50s, if you look at his 60s books, they're more sort of, how to tune in and turn on and drop out. And, there's sort of manuals of this or that, and Tibetan Book of the Dead and this kind of thing. But it's not until you get into the 70s with the Future History series of books that the scientific occultist side of Leary starts to come out. And I think that's what Wilson was very interested in also. And the two of they would have had a mutual interest that would have converged on Aleister Crowley as well.
Yeah.
Leary felt that he was, if not exactly the reincarnation of Crowley, which is how he put it, that he was continuing Crowley's, crusade to, of scientific illuminism and to raise the consciousness of mankind.
Right. Yeah. I have to ask you, because this is something that I get asked quite a bit, and as somebody who was familiar with Bob's work and also with Tim. A big thing that I get from a lot of people, because I tend to promulgate Bob's work, particularly Cosmic Trigger. And towards the end of that book, he talks about Timothy Leary's 8-circuit model of consciousness. And we're not going to go through all of the circuits or things like that. I'll have links in the show notes, everybody. But I wanted to ask you, like, what do you think about how Tim Leary viewed consciousness, and how Bob Wilson took this theory from Leary and kind of expanded it in the sense that he views consciousness as composed of certain circuits that get switched on, if you will. For the most part, he's talking metaphorically in this way, but he's using the computer as the metaphor, that by doing certain things, you're able to switch on to reach higher levels of consciousness. What do you make of something like the 8-circuit model of consciousness, Richard? Because it's one that a lot of people are fascinated by.
I think what Leary's interest was to encourage mutation in the human brain, and to do that on as wide a scale as possible. So I think that's what those books are about. And I think he's trying to, in the case of the 8-circuit model, they were trying to sort of give it a sort of quasi-scientific basis, as opposed to quasi-poetic or occulty, sort of thing. And I think that was kind of in many regards, a self-conscious way of doing that, and trying to anchor it in some kind of science, or at least scientific language.
Right. Yeah.
Or something that was scientifically aspirant, perhaps.
Yeah. He was very interested in computers. I know and of course, nascent computers. And when he did go to jail and had this thing called the Starseed Transmissions again, he came out with a book, I believe, called Neurologic, in which he introduces these 7 circuits. And then Bob Wilson wrote this book called Prometheus Rising, which is literally a guidebook tour of Leary's system, but with the Robert Anton Wilson take of it. What do you make of Prometheus Rising these days, Richard? Have you read it recently, or is it one of those? Is one of the things back in the past and once was?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to beg off on that. I haven't read that book since I was in my late 20s, early 30s, so it's been a while. So for me to comment on it would be a little.
Yeah. It's an interesting one. It's a fun one, but what I have to ask you then, like what do you think the biggest influence of Leary was on Bob Wilson? Things like reality tunnels. That's when people think of Bob Wilson, I think the two words that just always come up is reality tunnels. Well, Bob got that from Leary. Leary was the first person to talk about reality tunnels, but for most people, when we talk about reality tunnels, we usually say it's Bob.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that Leary always talked about was running the scripts, like this idea of, like you were talking about how he was into computers. He had the idea that you could sort of program yourself on a daily basis. You could wake up and say, am I going to be a winner today? Or am I going to run the loser script and just complain and the lazy script or whatever, so, and that's a really interesting way of looking at things, and it sort of presages in a lot of ways neurolinguistic programming, which of course Bob Wilson was very interested in as well. So I think that's a really interesting thing. And I certainly think that that's something that Bob would have said, oh, that's, a commonality in the way that he and Leary thought.
Yeah.
And I think there were a lot of ways that those two guys, they really clicked intellectually.
Yeah, definitely.
In those ways.
Yeah. I think one of for myself, and it's the way that Bob ends his first book, Cosmic Trigger, the very first one, is that he talks about just how positive Tim Leary was. In fact, I believe Cosmic Trigger ends with somebody asking Tim Leary, like, what do you do if somebody gives you nothing but negativity? And Tim Leary says, then give them back all the positivity you got. And then Bob Wilson ends his book by saying, and then I learned the final secret of the Illuminati. And I love something which is so sorely missing in every aspect of magic and the occult right now. Is just like an overriding positivity. I get it from Mitch Horowitz, but man.
Yes. Mitch is lovely, isn't he? He's got great energy.
The absolute best. But man, that is something that is sorely lacking in this day and age. It's just, and it's one thing that I think I love, that's perhaps the biggest thing that Bob got from Leary, is just like, you can remain positive. And if you start positively, as you said, if you start your day positively, usually good things usually good things happen to you. I love this. It's just the simple things for me from Leary that Bob took.
Yeah. It's, you're putting it out there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's funny because I've seen this in action with male friends of mine who, they get dumped. And then, they go through a period of, like they have to get back into the dating thing. And this one friend of mine and I were at a mall once. It was in Sherman Oaks, California. We were eating. And I said, you just have to like put it out there. You just have to be really like positive and like, just like smile, like just have like an ornery grin on your face and just, throw that out there. And suddenly this guy was like, he was getting female attention like crazy. You know what I mean? And so that he was playing a script, and that was when he went from feeling depressed to realizing that he could, snap on a smile and become Mr. Gregarious. And suddenly, and he did take that advice and he did do that. And it really sort of got him out of his, post being dumped by his girlfriend funk.
Right.
But it's just a good example of that kind of thing. And that is in a sense like, sort of a primitive take on neurolinguistic programming again.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The for people who haven't read Robert Anton Wilson, be prepared for a lot of talking about Timothy Leary. Be prepared for a lot of talking about Aleister Crowley, who is something we're going to talk about soon, and be prepared for a lot of talking about James Joyce. Truly, Bob loved James Joyce. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go into his love, but so much talking about Tim Leary. He seems like he really respected every aspect of Tim, and I think the way to approach it is that Tim was loved by Bob through every moment of Tim's life, because Tim died a decade before Bob did, and even towards his end, I think Bob's last book, Email to the Universe, I believe he talks a bit about Tim Leary, and he just doesn't have a bad word to say about him. It's extraordinary that Tim had that kind of influence. And Bob's not the only one that was just like, Tim really, really changed things.
Doug Rushkoff was very influenced by Leary as well. I definitely put me in that category. I would say for my, intellectual growth as a teen, I was very into Leary, very into William Burroughs, very into Crowley, and very into Throbbing Gristle also. But this is sort of on a separate side. But those were like my three, like my big three.
Yeah, definitely. So You had mentioned earlier that Tim Leary truly believed that he was the continuation of the great beast, Aleister Crowley. While that is a whole episode in and of itself, Tim Leary and Crowley, let's talk about Robert Anton Wilson and Crowley. So he was extremely enamored with Aleister Crowley. How do you view Crowley through Bob Wilson? Because Bob has a very peculiar and idiosyncratic take on Aleister Crowley. Can you maybe share with folks what you've gleaned from how Bob looks at the Great Beast? I mean, here's the thing that I find interesting is that Bob only had what he had as far as resources for approaching Aleister Crowley. Some of Crowley's stuff was in print, but for the most part, his view on Crowley was greatly informed by the book, which was written by Israel Regardie, which was Crowley's secretary. It's called Eye in the Triangle. And that was where he first was introduced to Aleister Crowley. I believe it was Alan Watts. He was going to a party, Alan Watts, and Alan Watts was like, you know what, Bob, do you know the best book I've read recently? It's this book, Eye of the Triangle. You should give it a read. And that's where Bob got his information for Crowley. And from there, he just continued to get rituals of what was available on Aleister Crowley. But he does have a take on Aleister Crowley that he thinks that he was given a bad rap. Do you think that Bob's vision of Aleister Crowley is a good one for people these days to kind of be like, Bob was
perhaps. I mean, I think Crowley wanted a bad rap, right?
I think so.
One of the things though that Bob what said to me one time that I thought was really interesting was, what if Crowley was like, what if it was all a forgery? Like, what if it was a big hoax? The whole thing. And my counter to that was, if you read the diaries, that's obviously not the case, because he was constantly wondering, am I the prophet of the Aeon? Am I the great, or am I just a deluded fool? You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of like soul searching that goes on over the years in Crowley's diaries that there definitely wasn't a hoax to him. But I thought that was interesting, because Bob was really interested in one of the Cosmic Trigger books, he talks about the Orson Welles documentary F for Fake.
Love
right?
it. Best,
about the Elmire de Horay, the art forger. So he was like really into that whole thing, and truly that you can't watch that. I mean, every time I watch that film, and I sometimes show that to the students that I teach at the university, and you can't watch that film without realizing, this is the most Bob Wilson-esque film that was ever.
Absolutely.
And by the way, Wilson was really, in addition to Ezra Pound and James Joyce and Crowley, he was really fascinated by Orson Welles and also Clint Eastwood.
Yes.
He was really big into, like, I noticed, like, that's the thing too, you go to somebody's place, you like look at their books, you look at their videos, and he had a lot of like Orson Welles VHS tapes and a lot of VHS tapes of Clint Eastwood's films.
Awesome. That's so good.
They were his favorite directors.
I grew up watching the Dollars trilogies. Like, truly, I'd been watching Clint Eastwood movies since I was 6. No wonder him and I got along so well. This person that I've never met. I one thing, Richard, and this is going to be the moment where, when you sat down with Bob and you were like, I really want to talk about Starseed Signal. He was like, this might be the moment of the interview for me. So I have always wanted to ask you, Richard, what is your take of what occurred with Robert Anton Wilson in I believe it was the early 70s. He took a ritual from one of the only texts of Aleister Crowley that he could get, called Book of Lies, and he dropped a load of acid. This is Robert Anton Wilson, and he went through this ritual, and these demon dogs appeared to him, and they were very terrifying. And there was some voice in the back of his head that basically said, if you feed them, they will become allies. And while he was tripping on acid, while doing this Aleister Crowley ritual, he fed these demon dogs shrimp cocktails because it was his favorite food. And then not too long after this, and for folks listening, this is the thing that, for the most part, is what Bob Wilson is mostly known for. Bob thought that he was contacted by alien beings or an intelligence from the star Sirius, the dual star Sirius, in one of the, if not the brightest star in the sky. And then later on, if you keep reading Bob Wilson, he's like, I don't really know if that was really what's going on, or I don't really know if what's happening, or it was, I went to some some psychic who said I was channeling a Chinese sage. And then towards the end of his life, he was starting to talk about how he thought it was Apuka from County Kerry. I have always wanted to ask you because, again, when he started talking about this on the DisinfoCon DVD, my mind melted. My mind, I was like, what is this guy talking about? And I wanted to know more. But I need to know, Richard, what do you think of how Bob interacted in this way with Crowley's ritual and had this kind of strange thing? It's the reason that Bob has been so important to a lot of us these days. I need to know what do you think of the whole situation?
I think it really happened.
Yeah.
I think it really happened. I mean, I think that Wilson, if you look at him, he's in a long line of people who might have been perceived as doing something interesting, shall we say, right? Or being interesting enough to deal with by these entities, that are not of us, but that are apart from us, and that are not some sort of psychological, projection, but that are something that can be, you can sort of ask them to prove themselves, as it were. You know what I mean? And so that, I mean, I have to tell you, everything about that book rings true to me. And as I said to you at the beginning of this talk, I discovered that book at exactly a moment in my life when some very strange things were happening to me. And so it was the brutal honesty of, and also the idea that, there's a bit of a high wire act, I think, when you're a grown ass man and you're talking about your these kind of experiences, and you don't, and I think that he had to go through a lot of, mental loops. How do I present this? And he's when you're writing a book, also, you're thinking about these kind of experiences, and you're sort of trying to get it down on paper, and and what you see is him wrestling with it, and trying to come up with an explanation for it, or how it might have happened, or by what agency these things occurred or were organized, as it were, to send him these kind of messages. And you see the same thing. I recently, it took me years to get around to this, so I'm embarrassed to say it, but one of the best books that I have read in a decade, I'm going to sound like Alan Watts right now, but one of the best books I've read in a decade is High Weirdness, Eric Davis's book about Wilson and Philip K. Dick and Terence McKenna. And so all three of those guys had some kind of contact experience where it took them years to sort of figure it out. I mean, they were, so they had different explanations for it over time, and part of it would be, I think, when you have a psychedelic experience and you're very close to it, it seems much more real than, 5 years later when you're saying like, yeah, I was really high. And, but at the same time, you might have a part of you saying like, yeah, but that, I'm pretty sure that happened. You know what I mean? But I would look at it and say that, like Wilson, like Philip K. Dick, like Terence McKenna, like Crowley, like Moses. You know what I mean? Like Abraham. These they had they were trying to communicate with and receive information from higher entities, non-corporeal entities, things that were not in front of them physically, but that they could communicate with. And I think that that's, I mean, how many times really had somebody written something like that in Cosmic Trigger? I think you could arguably go back to John Dee and Edward Kelly and look at the sort of spirit diaries they kept, because it's over and over again. The spirits are saying to them, you guys are assholes, idiots. And they're writing it down. You know what I mean? I always had this fantasy when I was reading, when I read about Dr. John Dee, that, like the Enochian entities are like Eddie Murphy and like Sandra Bernhard. You know what I mean? And they're just like giving them shit because it's all written down in a way you think, well, this would be embarrassing you wouldn't want to, write this about yourself for posterity, you know what I mean? And so it takes a great act of intellectual courage to write a book like that, but what do I think? I think it happened. I think it all happened. I don't think he's a liar. I don't think he's lying about any of it. Why would you lie about that kind of stuff? It doesn't make any sense. There's no point. How could you make that shit up? You couldn't. It had, you know what I'm saying? But it has that ring of truth. And I've never doubted a word of it. And that's the other thing too, is when you sit and talk with somebody like Bob about that kind of stuff, and they understand that you get it and that you don't, the reality of it comes out because it's a casual conversation that they don't need a footnote anymore.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But I want to tell you something that I'm reminded of, right? When one time I was at Bob's apartment in Capitola, and we were hanging out and we were getting high, and I started to tell him this really crazy story that had happened to me, but it's something that happened over a period of like 3 years, right? And I'm actually writing a book about that right now. I'm about a quarter of the way into this book, but it's sort of Cosmic Trigger-esque in the sense that it's autobiographical, but I can't take myself out of this story in that way, right? But we were sitting there, and I was telling him the story, and I said, and here's an interesting part. And this happens years before I've met him already, but this happens years before I knew him, right? So I'd already met him in LA, but I was working at a very low period of my life when I was like 28, 29, just about to turn 20. I was working at the Paramount Hotel in New York City, right?
Cool.
And as I had like a production deal with Showtime that it took me to LA, and I had money, and then they didn't buy anything from me, and the money ran out, and I couldn't really crack LA. It just seemed like an impossibility for me. And I thought I'd maybe just go back to New York where I know everybody, and I just try to pick up the remains of my career, back in Gotham. And so I was working in this hotel, and I'd been smoking DMT. I won't get into any of this, but I had a lot of experiences, right? I had a lot of weird experiences.
Yeah,
right?
no doubt.
And but this over the course of it was the Thanksgiving weekend, and the hotel was understaffed, and they said, "Does anybody want to work here? We'll pay you double time if you can work a double shift, and you can just stay in the hotel and sleep." And then so it was like these 16 hours, work 8 hours, sleep 8 hours, work it. And so I'm working this night, and it's like about midnight, and this guy who worked there, who I didn't know, I just knew him because he worked outside. He was one of the bellmen, right? And so I knew him only as like, "Hey man, how's it going?" I didn't know his name or anything. But this guy walks up to me. I'm behind I was the concierge there, right? So I'm behind the counter, and I'm just sitting there, and the guy goes, "Hey man, you want to go smoke a joint?" I'm like, "Yeah." And so I said, "I got some too." And I had because I was there overnight, right? So I had this bag with me, like a gym bag, and I had a bong in it, right? Because I was prepared, and I had several books, right? And so we went downstairs at this in this place, and underneath the Paramount Hotel was the remains, shall we say? It was like it had been a speakeasy, right? It had been this big nightclub, and it was like, so there were like these opulent, like like these wonderful, like leather, banquettes and tables and a big bar with mirrors and a big stage. And I was like, holy shit. And I had no idea this was there, right? And then a lot of beer, like smashed beer bottles and shit like that. You know what I mean? But it was there in the basement of this. It was underneath this hotel, right? And I think now it's the Sony Theater, right? But at the time it was basically just rubble. And like I say, these like leather banquettes and stuff, the remains of what had been a speakeasy. So anyways, this guy and I are talking, we're smoking a joint. And he sees this book in my bag, and he goes, "Oh, I've read that Terence McKenna book. What else do you have?" And he picks up the stack I had like 4 or 5 books that I had brought with me to read that over that weekend. And he goes, "Oh, Cosmic Trigger." And he goes, I was reading the book actively at that time, right? He goes, "Oh, Cosmic Trigger. I used to have this edition of the book, but I sold it to the bookstore where I was working before I left LA." I said, "Oh, really? What bookstore did you work at in LA?" And he goes, "The Brand Bookstore." I said, "I bought this at the Brand Bookstore." And you know where this story is going.
Man, that's awesome.
Right? And I got to tell Bob that story. And his jaw dropped, because that's a pretty good one, especially when it's the granddaddy of all all coincidence synchronicity books, and you have a synchronicity that's that tight about it.
Amazing. That's incredible.
I still have that book.
Yeah, you're not getting rid of that one, Richard. I hate to
No,
say
I'm not getting rid of that one.
One of the things that I think is most interesting, and particularly as somebody myself who read Cosmic Trigger when I was 20, read it when I was 20, is that as initially, I think for everybody, we want to be so enamored, especially as we get involved with magic and the occult, with the enamored with the idea of talking to higher entities. But I'll say this for folks listening to the podcast. What happened and how Bob interpreted that experience through the years is as important to the story of that experience. Because he was constantly skeptical about what actually went on there. He was skeptical as like, well, was it, if you ever read, in my mind, I love Cosmic Trigger 1, but I've read Cosmic Trigger 2 more than I've read Cosmic Trigger 1, because the real Robert Anton Wilson really comes out in that one. And spoiler alert, it deals with a lot of the aftermath of the death of his youngest child, Luna, and perfect title, Down to Earth. And Bob in that one is constantly searching for what remains, what happens after somebody has had an experience, like in the very first Cosmic Trigger. And a lot of people, they really want to do the things in Cosmic Trigger 1 without realizing that the story doesn't end once you close Cosmic Trigger 1. There's more to the story for Bob. And I think that the way that he was skeptical about that experience, because in Cosmic Trigger 2, he says, I think all of this stuff is in my brain. He literally ends the chapter after he talks about doing LSD and doing the Aleister Crowley ritual. He's like, this stuff is all in my brain, which is a very Crowley-esque thing to say, although he recounted it in later years about, the demons of a Goetia only exist in your brain. These are just parts of your brain. I think Bob's way of contextualizing that experience is as much a part of the story of having that kind of an experience as much as we think that it's just cool that he was talking to stuff from Sirius, and perhaps there was the Dogon tribe in Africa and they knew about Sirius beforehand, which is all the stuff that everybody wants to get involved with. But there's sometimes a reason that it's hard to talk about these experiences when you go to talk to people about these things. Leary didn't want to talk about Starseed. Sometimes Bob, when people would ask him, he would be very flippant about the Sirius transmissions or whatever we want to call them. He'd just kind of be like, well, I was either talking with things, aliens or Chinese sage, or it was just my mind playing tricks on me, and it's just about contextualizing the experience. So,
the thing is, he's not being cynical.
No, exactly. Yeah.
He describes it that way.
Yeah. No, he's not trying to get people to like fuck off. He's just like, it's a process.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It's a process. I mean, as you're going to get older, and again, it's the further away you would get from an event like that. But I don't think, you would also have to say like, well, it was the 70s.
Right.
You know what I mean? I think that the Starseed transmissions, I think there was a tendency to think like, oh, maybe this is a real thing. And then, the prophecies, as it were, don't happen, right, that were contained in that transmission, that they get over a Ouija board. And, and so it starts to look like wishful thinking on Larry's part while he's in prison, that he's doing something proactive. I mean, it's, he's trying to project his mind, over the prison walls or what, I think you could sort of look at that scenario and say, well, maybe it was just that.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that other experiences aren't, you know what I mean? That are, so I would say that, if you look at, especially at Leary's life, he ends up, doing a lot of, the things that happened to him, the ways that he was pulled by history are fascinating, but they're occult in the sense that that didn't just happen to anybody. That happened to somebody who was ready to play that role, if you will. And I also think that you could look at someone like Wilson and say, he was contacted for a reason. The reason being, he's had one of the most far out minds on the planet. And that's why, you could, there's all kinds of different ways to look at it. It wasn't like I ever discussed that with him, like later in life, like, did that really happen? Do you still think it really happened? Because I didn't feel the necessity to ask that question, because I believe that it did happen.
Right.
I believe it happened the way that he described it. I believe that it happened because he doesn't describe it in a dogmatic way. These events that happened to him in the mid 70s, he describes it from various points of view. And, and then that sort of philosophy is developed over time writ large in his work, not just about what happened to him, but when you look at that through the lens of his later writing, I don't think he's disavowing it in any way.
No,
not in any way. I never got that feeling from him at all.
definitely. Yeah.
But at the same time, he wasn't saying, but it was definitely this.
Right.
And again, he wasn't being cynical either. It
No,
was what he was thinking. He was just telling you what he was thinking at that time.
definitely. Yeah. For somebody like yourself who was familiar with Aleister Crowley before they, got into the work of Robert Anton Wilson, would you say that Robert Anton Wilson is a good place for people to perhaps start to learn about Aleister Crowley? Because for a long period of time before the internet, most people who didn't know about Crowley were kind of introduced to Crowley mostly through Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Anton Wilson talking about him. Do you still think that as the years roll by, that Bob is a good, first port of call to dip your toes in the Lemic waters, if you will?
Well, I mean, two things. One is I disagree that Bob was the main conduit for Crowley in the counterculture, because that's I think that's definitely not true, because those books were widely distributed.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So when the Confessions of Aleister Crowley is printed in 1969, that causes a bit of a sensation. You know what I mean? But it's the same people who are reading Tolkien and Robert Heinlein and stuff like that, and so it becomes a part of that mix. And I think that it takes off from there more than Bob necessarily, because I mean, the other thing too is like the Cosmic Trigger. I didn't, I came across that book, I was saying relatively late, I guess, but it would have been like in the 90s. So it had already been like an 15 to 18-year-old book, but that book wasn't that easy to get a hold of. It's not, keep in mind that you could live in New York City and go to, go on a track around the bookstores once a week, like I did, and never come across that book at all. Right. You know what I mean? And then so that book, I think, gained its the largest distribution was when New Falcon put it out. But I mean, but I think that's a bit later in the game for the Crowley thing. So I wanted to mention that. So I don't think that Bob was that. It certainly wasn't for me, but but I am asked often, where does one start with Crowley?
Yeah.
Right. And so let me answer the question like that. It wouldn't necessarily be with Bob's books, no. But it would be in the biographies. I think if you're going to read Crowley, I think the first port of call I would think would be Perdurabo, Richard Kaczynski's book, right? And then either reading it on a parallel track simultaneously, or just afterwards reading the Confessions.
Right.
And then reading perhaps another biography, like King of the Shadow Realm by John Simmons is another good one, right? Or his earlier book, about Crowley. But reading those, and then the thing about Crowley is you have to sort of read all of it, then, and including the biographies. I think that's the most important thing to be grounded in it. You have to know about his life, because he's constantly referring to himself and his life, and so it's so self-referential that if you don't know what his life was all about, you're not going to make heads or tails out of anything that he wrote. Right. I would look at it that way. But so with Crowley, the way to get into Crowley is, I would say, start with the biographies of him, then start reading like the holy books and the ones that he sort of held higher in his canon of work, and then read the lesser ones, and then read everything again, and then read it a third time, right? Because Crowley it's not something that you're going to get in a matter of a year or two. It's something that you're going to get over decades, that you have to work with that over decades and decades, because to really get, like a comprehension of what he was on about. Right. So,
yeah.
That's the way I would look at it. And I think that in that way, Crowley, getting back to Bob, it's like he was fascinated by Crowley. He was fascinated by James Joyce. He was fascinated by Ezra Pound. And these are people, if you think about it, that if you could study them for a lifetime, and how are you going to make any money from that?
Right.
You see what I'm saying? It's like, oh, I have a PhD in Crowley. Do you now?
Right.
So what do you do for a living? You know what I'm saying? Like, these were topics that you had to study because you loved them, because you wanted to wrestle it to the ground and understand every single bit of it. I think once somebody is bitten by like understanding James Joyce, they're gonna carry on with that. It becomes a lifetime of study in those ways. And it was a lifetime of study, obviously, for Bob. So I see Crowley in that way. I think it's something that literally takes decades to is there an introduction? Yeah, it's the biography.
Right.
Find out about his life, the way that he regarded himself, and then read what he said about himself in his own writing, and then again read it again, and then read it again. And you have to read all of it really to comprehend any of it. I mean, that's the thing. It's just like the small parts. With Crowley, very often the details come in something that was published as a pamphlet.
Right.
You know.
Very much so. I would agree that, and what's interesting, you bring up Richard Kaczynski's Perdurabo, because it really shows the details of Crowley's life, which if you do that and read that biography and then go to read what Bob wrote about Aleister Crowley, you'll find that a lot of the details that Bob wrote about Crowley's life and stuff were actually wrong. Bob kind of,
it's a pre-internet era. You fact check. I mean, you can't blame him for that.
No.
It's funny. A couple of days ago, I found this book in the attic. It's called Cult Films by Danny Peary, right? And it was one of the most influential books about sort of cult movies, right? And there's 3 volumes of it, but it was written in the late 70s, early 80s. And literally, he is describing moments in famous films that do not happen now.
Right.
It's the way he remembered it, but he remembered it wrong.
Yeah.
It's funny to see something like that, but that book is just an incredible, like, one after another example of like him telling, oh, here's something that happened in Harold and Maude. No, it didn't. It's hard to do that kind of stuff. And I think with Crowley, where would you have found the definitive answer in the 70s?
Yeah, it was all Israel Regardie's book, and Israel Regardie really had a bone to pick with Crowley. He admired Crowley, but he also, because he was so close to Crowley, that book literally ends after the Karanzan summoning in the desert there, and like that's all Robert Anton Wilson had as far as biographical information. He later on, I think, got
the confessions.
Yeah, he later on got the confessions. But a lot of times when people go out and find information about Crowley via Robert Anton Wilson, just know that, and this is my opinion, Bob's far out view of Aleister Crowley is pretty good. I like it. He says that there are many ways of looking at Crowley. I like to look at him as a scientist in the consciousness alteration field, a pioneer, a forerunner of Tim Leary and Stan Groff, John Lilly, and all the great consciousness researchers of the last 30 years. Crowley was 50 years ahead of everyone else. I like that aspect that Bob has of Aleister Crowley. I agree with it in some regard. But yeah, for folks that come to Aleister Crowley via Bob, just realize that a lot of the finer details when you zoom in, he doesn't really have them right. Just something to be wary about. But there was a really good book released recently called Lion of Light that was released by Hilaritas Press. That it's got an awful cover that makes Aleister Crowley look like Dean Norris from Breaking Bad. But it's just the stuff in there is really good. There's an essay in there called "Do What Thou Wilt" that was never released. Really wonderful stuff. I like Bob's take on Crowley from a distance, but I have my issues with Crowley. Everybody does. But I like Bob Wilson's version of Crowley more than I like Crowley's version of Crowley. Perhaps that's a way to put it. I don't know if you'd agree with that or not, but
it's like Tim Leary always said: people get the Tim Leary they want or they deserve.
Right, exactly. And I think the same thing happens with Aleister Crowley.
He's a multifaceted.
So much so.
He's a genius and he's a bastard at the same time.
Yeah. And it's funny, somebody that you also had on the Disinformation or the Disinfo Con, Adam Parfait. His publishing company, Feral House, released a book called Secret Agent 666, which is one of those books. I don't know if you've read it, Richard, but when you were talking about how Aleister Crowley could very well be a hoax in some things, there's parts of that book that make me think that might actually be the case, that he was more of an intelligence asset than a lot of people bring up. Even Richard Kaczynski was like, there are things brought up in that book that might make me have to go back and rewrite parts of Perdurabo. And it's a dark horse of a book that I think more people should read about Aleister Crowley. There are some things that Crowley did that are very peculiar and very much speak to him having this other facet that a lot of people involved in magic don't want to confront because it blows holes in a lot of belief systems. But
that's right. It's funny. Adam sent me that book years ago, and I have it in the attic. Now I'm going to dig it out and read it. So
it's an incredible book. And Feral House was another one of those publishing companies like Disinformation that was just when those books came out, you grabbed them, like no matter what it was, even if you didn't like them. Like and Adam, rest in peace. Just yeah, man, the mid to late '90s was such a period of time and is really wonderful. We really don't have anything like it, and I don't want to be that old man rocking back and forth in a chair, but
Well, the counterculture as it existed then no longer
no,
exists. I mean, it's as simple as that. I get asked that question all the time, and it's like, no, like, well, like it's there. It just doesn't exist anymore. You know what I mean? Like all of those ideas have been. Well, actually, I was going to say something that's interesting. I'll start by finishing my thought, which I was going to say a lot of those ideas have sort of been broken apart, and you find them in everywhere in the popular culture. You know what I mean? And it's just, it's there, and and with magic as well, you know what I mean? Like you're seeing that kind of thing when they're talking about chaos magic and WandaVision and stuff like this. I mean, it's like these ideas are sort of out there, but the classical counterculture as it existed, I think died, arguably like by 2004. It was just
yeah,
like you know and but there's but Grant Morrison is still, you know what I mean, like he's there and he's doing it. I mean, there's that spirit lives on, but the counterculture itself does not.
yeah, definitely, yeah. I have to ask you because we're coming towards the end of the show here, Richard. What do you find most striking about Robert Anton Wilson's work as a whole? Does he still have lessons for people in this day and age? Do you talk to younger people? Do you still think that there's things worth sharing about Robert Anton Wilson with people, or is he?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, God, absolutely. I mean, getting back to Eric Davis's book. I mean, the reason that I'm so high on that book, and I think it's just really a masterpiece, is that, and why that I think that book will become a pivotal book, like in the same sense that Cosmic Trigger became this sort of pivotal book, introducing people to McKenna or Robert Temple, or the starseed ideas of Timothy Leary, which obviously weren't well known at the time. I mean, the Starseed Transmission came out as a little tiny pamphlet, a
Right.
little flimsy little book, and that's, I have one, but I mean, how many of those books even survived? But how many? He was in jail, so how widely distributed was that? People found out about that through Bob. And in the same way, I feel that way with Eric's book, is that it gives someone who is younger the pointers, but this is why this is important, right? And the same way that you were saying, like there was Bob Wilson's version of Crowley, Eric Davis's version of Bob Wilson is fascinating, incredibly well done. Well, I mean, it's just he knew him also. He knew Bob. So, but I think that Eric's book it puts in context McKenna, Wilson, and Philip K. Dick in a way that someone younger could say, like, okay, here's how I'm going to go out and just fan out through this body of work and get what is potentially of value to me. Right. So there's a roadmap to Bob's work that I would say exists in Eric's book and also in Gabriel Kennedy's book,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is very, very good.
Yeah. Was that just the new book that was released?
New biography, yeah.
So for folks listening, there's a new biography called Chapel Perilous about Robert Anton Wilson. I haven't had a chance to read it. I probably should have picked it up.
Oh, it's terrific. You'll love it.
Yeah.
You will love it. He captures him really, really well.
Okay. Yeah.
He captures the man and the ideas. It's the definitive book about Wilson. There's not going to be a better book about Wilson that will ever come along, because the people who he would have talked to are going to be long gone by that time. So, I'm saying, like, this is it. But it's so well done. I mean, if this is the one, believe me, you want it to be the one.
For sure.
You'll love it.
For yourself, Richard, what do you think is the message of Bob that is worth sharing with people these days that are interested in the weirdness? That I know people probably listened to my show and they probably heard me talk about Robert Anton Wilson ad nauseum, but there's still some people that would be like, he seems like an old hippie relic, a kind of sexist old relic. But what do you think is there something you'd be like, listen here, whippersnapper, you need to understand that this is something important that Bob has given us. What is that for you, Richard?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, one is you could look at the Illuminatus trilogy and say, okay, this basically predicts the world we live in.
Right.
Right. At the time, it was satire. It's, but right now it's like Idiocracy. It's like the time's caught up, and they caught up arguably much quicker with that film than they did with Illuminatus. But, he's predicting something that would happen. And it shows you, like also with Gravity's Rainbow, another very large book, that this is what's happening. This is the complexity that's starting to knit itself into our reality, and this is what's the reality that's being created by the group mind, as it were, some of us who are hallucinating,
Right.
So I think that's important. But I think I have to tell you, the thing that I think is the most important about Bob is the cosmic trigger, and 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 again, I think that book will be just in the near future and in the in the far future, it will be discussed and dissected a lot because there's so much there to chew on that in that book. But for me, I think that somebody who was experiencing something like what Bob experiences in that book, it's a guidebook to that. It's a map. It shows you exactly this is the terrain that you're going to have to like figure out a way through. And that to me was like a guidebook, like a map to that kind of thing. And again, I was saying to you earlier is that when it was happening to me, I had the luck, the
Right.
good fortune to be reading that book at the time, right? I had bought it before I left LA, so I had that book had been in storage, and I got it out, and then I'm reading it, and then a bunch of, like I say, a bunch of really crazy stuff started happening because I was smoking DMT a lot at the time. But it's sort of like, but here's the thing, right? I look at that experience that happened to me, and I think like, okay, I was doing the same kind of things that Bob was doing. I wasn't like smoking DMT to party on it. Obviously, you're gonna be flat on your ass if you're gonna
Have a
smoke
bad
DMT at
time.
a party. Yeah, it's not. But you're doing something like that for some kind of deep meditation, right? I wasn't doing it for hedonistic reasons, although that's perfectly fine as well. But I was doing it because I felt at that time I just like, okay, I have to do something that will just change my mind,
Right.
that will just get me out of the funk that I'm in, give me some new ideas that I can make films about or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like I needed something to sort of, just to blow all the bad shit out of my brain. And so I was going, taking a lot of psychedelics at a short period of time, frequently. And again, in that book, I just happened to be reading it, and I thought, oh, I'm doing this same thing. And then boom, a lot of weird things started happening to me. And so that the value in that experience is that it's one of the very first books where somebody talks about it openly and honestly, and again, very courageously about what had happened to them. So that is there for anybody that comes along afterwards. They can look at that book and say, shit, this is like something that happened to me, and they can make sense of it. Or they can make sense of it in the same way that Bob made sense of it, which is to see it from a lot of different perspectives and to not get hung up on it in one way that could make you nuts.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because that's the thing too, is a situation like that, when you start to mess with occult stuff and things start to happen, you could really go off the deep end with that kind of stuff if you take it that seriously. I mean, the way to deal with that kind of thing when it's happening to you is to be skeptical. It's to accept it. It's not to reject it, but you have to you have to test it. There has to be some level of like, am I deluding myself or not? And when you can get to the point where you have decided that no, I'm not deluding myself, this is actually happening, then you will always have the cosmic trigger to refer to.
Definitely. That's so well put, Richard. I love every aspect of that. I would only tack onto that as well is my love for Cosmic Trigger 2 as well. It's one that a lot of people just kind of don't talk about. I love those two books. Cosmic Trigger 3 is a bit of it's one where he's trying to talk about the death of Robert Shea, which is interesting in its own regard. But I love Cosmic Trigger 1, and I think that as important because it takes place quite a number of years after Cosmic Trigger 1 is Cosmic Trigger 2 Down to Earth. But there is no better encapsulation of what happens when you have a mystical occult experience than
Yeah.
Cosmic Trigger. It is the best, and I doubt anybody will do better over the next 100 years. I have to ask you, do you think Bob's going to be around? Do you think people are still going to be referring to Bob's work in 100 years?
Some people.
Yeah.
Some people. But the thing about it is, somebody like Bob, I mean, and it's with Leary as well. I mean, he was obviously more famous than Bob, but I think that those ideas live on in people who will have been informed by them and inspired by them, and will, as it were, recapitulate those ideas in the same way that Leary recapitulated a lot of the ideas of Crowley. You know, so yes, do I think Bob will? Yes, I think that some people will still study him in the sense that yeah, you say, well, we're 100 years past, when James Joyce was relevant, you know what I mean? So that, so like, or I don't know when Joyce died, maybe in the 40s, but so we're nearly 100 years, and are people as interested in James? No, but there certainly are people who are going to study that. And like I say, they're going to wrestle it to the ground. They're going to understand every single word and reference that that guy made.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and they're going to have to figure out a way to make a living.
For sure. I think one of the things that I had the pleasure of doing for research for this episode, Richard, was I took some time to go through Bob's books again, some of my more favorite of Bob's books. And while there's some ideas that I'm not totally enamored with still, particularly one thing we didn't get onto this episode is some of Timothy Leary's more transhumanistic aspects like SMILE or SMI squared LE. But a lot of what Bob does, I still think is very relevant for people. But even more than any of that, Robert Anton Wilson is a fucking awesome writer.
Yeah.
Holy shit. He is
Yep.
so good at writing. Like, it's when I went through that period of time where I was just reading, become so familiar with the way that he writes. And then once I stopped, I kind of gained some distance on how he wrote, and coming back to him for this episode, my God, he's good. He is so funny, so to the point, so eloquent, beautiful. There's parts that I got emotional reading some, and not just of horrible things that happened to his life. The man makes ideas beautiful in a way that is effortless, that is striking to me. And as much as I like his fiction, it's when he turns to his nonfiction and he's talking about himself that you really see how talented of a writer he was. And that, to me, is more than anything, is Bob's legacy. It's such a comfy, comforting, spectacular blanket to get lost in Bob's words when you read them on a page. And it's truly a gift. Even if I don't agree with everything he's blabbing on about, my God, he's a great writer.
Mm-hmm. He also is a writer who wrote like he spoke.
Right.
Right. And that kind of conversational writing, I think is really hard to do.
It is.
And it gets the reader on your side. But I'm trying to think of other writers, like Kurt Vonnegut did that, I think, really well. Tom Robbins.
Right.
Does that. There's a certain Richard Brodigan also, would be somebody else I would name. But that's sort of that way that, like, you it's conversational writing, but also you hear the writer's voice coming through. And that's, and if you read Bob's nonfiction, that's the way he talked.
Yeah, definitely.
He was, when he told the story, he would tell them the same way. You know what I mean? Like, as all writers do, you figure out the way to write it, and then that's what you tell the story after that. You know what I mean? So, I
got out of the Edmonton Public Library. There was a 7 or 8 cassette tape. Robert Anton Wilson Explains Everything, or Old Bob Explains His Everything. And I would just drive around. When I had to drive, I would just put those tapes in, and I would get those.
Me too. Because they're fantastic on a commute. I agree.
Because he does write like he talks. And that's something that I think is sorely missing in this day and age, is that there's really not a lot of people that can write about this kind of stuff with the kind of eloquence and the approachability and just sheer joy of reading his words than Bob. And that's something I truly miss since his passing in 2007 was, even towards the end, his last books are still brilliant and funny and striking. And even if he's talking about another James Joyce, he's written another chapter about James Joyce, they're still just wonderful to behold. He really had a way with language. And to me, and I'm 41 years old. As I said, just had my birthday. Striking how brilliant a writer he is. And I wish, serious, Tim Leary, Aleister Crowley. But I hope that his legacy in 100 years' time is just how great a writer he was. Brilliant, funny, compassionate, so relatable. Oh my gosh, so relatable. And nobody else will have written a book about having a mystical experience as good as Bob. He did it better than anyone else, and it's really quite wonderful. I have to ask.
It's the book of that genre.
Yeah, it truly is. I have to ask you, Richard, what is your favorite memory of the time you spent with Robert Anton Wilson?
It was all great.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I'm hanging out with one of my heroes. It was always great. He was never disappointing. He was always marvelous.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was what you wanted him to be.
Right.
It was wonderful. You know what I mean? He was intelligent. He was courageous. And again, when you could talk to somebody like that and they don't have to footnote anything, the conversation is deep and it's fun, and it was always great to be with him. To be welcomed into his home. To be able to look at his bookshelves. See what was in the fridge.
Did you meet his wife?
No, I never met her.
You never met her? No. Yeah. Oh, it's a shame. She sounded like a wonderful person. Behind every great man is a great woman, and she really. This is terrible that I've forgotten her name. I want to say Leah, but I don't think that's right.
Arlen.
Arlen, that's right. Arlen. There we go. Arlen. Yeah, she seemed like just a wonderful person. Oh my goodness, Richard.
I will tell you one thing. You can remind me of that because when you brought up Arlen, it did jog a memory. He and I were sitting on there was like a little like a porch, I guess, a patio veranda. He was in an apartment building, right? One is sort of a modernish, maybe built in the 80s, sort of California apartment building, right? And it was in Capitola, so it's near Santa Cruz, and it's right on the water. Right. And interestingly, he never walked down to the ocean. He never walked down to the beach once. But he was, then again, he was so close to it that, so we're sitting there on this, this out, sliding glass door. But we're sitting there. It's like room for like two chairs. And I'm smoking a joint and he's got Marlboro Reds. And I say, Bob, those are going to kill you. And he takes out a bunch of cigarettes and he makes like he's going to smoke like three at once, like, let me die faster. And I was like, oh, and he was like, but he said something that really stuck with me. And he said, when you get older, everybody that you ever loved or cared about dies. If they die before you, that's your experience, is seeing everything that you love just dying off. And all of the musicians that you admire not dying and not making any more music, so you don't care about music anymore. But he was just kind of like he was basically like saying, like, I'm over it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like when his wife died, and it was just like, and poor health. I just think there was a point where he was just over it. But that was a, like I say, a very poignant explanation of where he was at, which was the things that I've loved are no longer around me.
I think it's kind of on us, on myself, to try and keep the remnants of the things that we loved about Bob alive in some way and refreshing. Like I would never tell people don't engage with Robert Anton Wilson. I know some people now are like, I'm done with Bob because he talks about this or he talks about that. I would never at any point. I still think he's such a special and worthy person to spend at least one book, Cosmic Trigger. But if you want to spend at least 6 months of your life grabbing a lot of his work, he's such a worthy person. And I'm just going to say this, Richard, you're very lucky to know him.
Oh, for sure. Oh God, yeah. One of the great joys of my life was knowing Bob.
Yeah. I never got the opportunity, and it's in some way, as I said, I feel like I knew him, but no, he was just such an amazing soul, and it's our job now to make everybody realize just how great of a writer he was and how great of a person he was. So thank you so much for joining me, Richard. Richard, you have done the world a service. As I said, this podcast doesn't exist if you had never did Disinfo Con. If you never did the photo shoot for that, for the cover of that DVD, this podcast wouldn't be here. My life wouldn't be the way that it is. You single-handedly, through your discretion as to who you wanted to talk to and the people that interested you, have caused an avalanche that is so important to myself and a lot of people of my generation. So I have to say, I thank you so much for it. There was a period of time where I just seemed to hear less and less from Richard Metzger. I would follow great music recommendations on dangerousminds.net, and I loved visiting that website when it was really active. And then you just kind of disappeared for a little bit. And lo and behold, about 6 months ago, a Kickstarter appeared, and there was this guy from this DVD there again, cigarette no longer in his hand, but there nevertheless look a little bit grayer, but still as striking as ever. Advertising something called Magic Show. Would you like to tell the listeners of what magic is this? What exactly is Magic Show?
I would love to. Thank you for asking. Magic Show is a project that I've been working on since 2020. That was when the idea was first written down, and then it started to circulate as a written idea. And then I sent it to Doug Rushkoff, who's one of my best friends, and he said, "I really love this. I would be interested in coming on as like a producer on this. Would you be interested in that?" I'm like, "Come on." Of course I would be, and so Doug introduced me then to his good friend Laura Schechter, who is well known as a YA author under the pen name Lauren Oliver. And so Laura's company, she's like, "What would it take you to do a pilot for something like this?" Because she was really behind it, loved the idea, and I said, "Well, so I sort of spec'd it out and said," she's like, "That's doable." And then it was, so and so it was born, basically. It was basically Laura saying, "There's development money from Amazon Prime. Let's do this," in so many words. And so that's how it happened. And then I and the producer and the guy who's shooting it and editing it, Eric Middleman, is an old friend of mine. And then the producer, Judd Cherry, the three of us went around. We shot 5 days in LA. We shot 3 days in New York. And we were in London for 12 days, and we shot 7 of those. So we interviewed over, at this point, all told, 50, I think there's like 55 people. There's more than 60 hours of footage. And I got to, basically ask people, like, how do you do your magic? So it's an exploration. It means to be a large conversation with over 50 people about what is modern occultism, how do they work their magic in today? You know what I mean? And so it's that. And so there's 4 episodes, and the company didn't have the money to finish it, and so I did the Kickstarter, basically. And my good friend Tom Nagovin, who is a well known as a publisher of art books, and he does a lot of Kickstarters, and he was really expert in it. And we were talking on the phone one day, and I said, "Yeah, this project was like," he's like, "What? You have what?" And I was like, "Yeah." I was like, he's like, "How many hours?" He's like, "Why don't you just do a Kickstarter to finish it?" I was like, I never thought about that before. And so I was like pulled into this process, and we just basically started immediately. Like, we're going to do this. And so it went from like the end of May, and I think we launched it about 30 days later, maybe. So it was a 40-day process. To anybody listening to this who decides that they want to do a Kickstarter, think about that before you decide to do it, because it was one of the most stressful things that I have ever done. It was, you cannot believe, because your biorhythms are, they're married to this, they're chained to this idea of like, are people donating to this, or are people backing this or not? And in my case, I went through this process. It's for the first 35 days of the 40 days, it didn't look like it was going to make its goal.
Right.
So I'm thinking, okay, this is great. I get to put myself out on a limb and make a public failure of myself. So that was kind of what I'm thinking. Like this, and that becomes stressful. You know what I mean? Like, you pick up in the middle of the night to take a piss. You're looking at your Kickstarter on your phone. You know what I mean? And it's like, oh, I can't go back to sleep now. But it was very stressful, right? But beyond that, I was doing like often like 2 podcasts a day.
Yeah.
And having to contact people, barter on social media. I'll put your post on my Facebook page if you'll put my post on your Facebook page. Like, it was this constant thing. And then creating short form content for Twitter and TikTok and yada yada yada. It was a very, very, very stressful situation that I would not wish on my worst enemy. It was really that bad. It took like 2 weeks of just like fucking looking at a blank wall, you know what I mean, just to recover from it. I was bone tired when that was all done, and but it was successful.
Yes.
And so I've been working on it, and it is basically just a few hours away from being completed, and then we're gonna premiere it in like a live streaming thing on the internet for the people who backed it on Kickstarter, and I'm quite pleased with it, I have to say. I mean, it's the idea was to have it done for Halloween.
Right.
That didn't happen because when I went to LA on October the 15th, so just a month ago, and taped an interview with Eric Davis, right? Because I was bitterly disappointed that I didn't get to interview Eric 2 years ago. And so, to be able to put him in the show was like, a great thing, right? And so I suddenly had this, like, I interviewed Eric for 3 brilliant hours. He was just one of the most incredible interviewees. And the thing was, when you're producing television, you're listening to people, and every time they say something that you want, you're clicking it off in your head, like, okay, I can use that, I can use that. And it was just like, it was an embarrassment of riches. And then I got home, and so we'd had an edit of it that existed already, right? There was a rough cut of this hour-long show, 40-minute long show. And I had to add Eric into it, but I'd also, Grant Morrison's interview had not made it into the thing. So I got to add both Grant and Eric to this program, which I thought was already very fucking good.
Right.
And now I elevate it, like, if you just add one of those two guys to it, it's going to bring it up another level. But to add both of them, it's like, hello. And so I'm saying I'm quite pleased with it. It's we have a couple more edit sessions until it's done. And I'm really interested. I'm excited to get it out there. I want to see what people think about it. And I think that I'm hoping that people who were fans of that show that I did 25 years ago, that they're going to not be disappointed by this one, because I think it's in my mind, it's a classic counterculture mindfuck, right? It's got that flavor of that kind of thing. And it's truly transgressive also. You'll see. It's like, there's a point where people are going to be watching this, and they're going to get to the last part of it, and it's going to be like, what the fuck did I just watch? What the fuck did that? And that's I live for that. That's my life's work. You know what I mean? So, but like I say, I'm anxious to get it out there and let people see it. I've been working on it for a damn long time. It's time to show it to people. Just finish it and get it out there.
I have to ask, what precipitated this return to magic? Because there's very little mention of magic from what I remember when I was on dangerousminds.net. It would come up. It would come up.
Yeah.
There'd be things about Austin Osman's Spare, but what precipitated this? Like, now Richard Metzger, have to revisit this idea of magic for people. Did you feel it's culturally we're at a moment where it's like, this is important?
Yeah, that's it exactly. I started to think. It was a few things. One is, I mean, the project came up because of a good friend of mine said we should do a show about magic together. I'm like, oh, that's a really good idea. And then when I actually went away and wrote the treatment, he didn't like it. My good friend Chris, and he didn't like it, but he was cool with it. He didn't want to do it, and so it was on paper, and then it gets out there. But after it was the production was done, not the editing, but the production was done. And we were trying to figure out, like, how we're going to do this. Grant Morrison and Doug Rushkoff and I had a Zoom call, and on that call, Grant was he had just seen the pilot. He really liked it a lot, right? So he was quite like high on it and wanting to get involved. He was instrumental in helping us raise the money for this. I mean, like, Grant is one of the real heroes of this thing seeing the light of day, right? But Grant was very much of the attitude of, like, we are the old guys now. We are the same age that Bob Wilson and Leary were when we met them. Kenneth Anger, these sort of, the classic old guard, and it's incumbent upon us to, pass what we know on, as it were. And he was like, so I think it would be good if we did some kind of teaching thing. And I started to really think about that. And it was quite a turn on for me. And I have to say, like, you say, like, oh, it was like I didn't hear from you for like a long time. I really withdrew from the world about 2004 in a large way. Like, when I left Disinformation, that was like 2006, maybe. I think that was the last time I went into the office. I think the contract was signed where I got out of it, but like the first day of 2007, or it was around that time period. But after that, I had just gotten married, and I didn't want to do anything other than to spend time with my wife. That's all I really wanted to do, magically or otherwise. You see what I'm saying? And so by doing Dangerous Minds, we were always at home. So it was a very mellow situation. You can do it from anywhere. You can go on vacation. You can travel. You can live where we live, and you can do your job anywhere. And it just seemed like a good idea to do that. But I just felt like, in a sense, like just withdrawing from the world. You know what I mean? I didn't want to talk about magic. I didn't want to talk about conspiracy theories or counterculture, because I had already done that. And to me, it was just like, okay, I've done this. I mean, when I was writing about conspiracy theories and stuff like that, and I was in my early 30s creating content about something that I was interested in when I was in my 20s.
Right.
I had already kind of moved on from it
right.
intellectually. People would always say like, "Oh, what conspiracy theories have you looked into that you came to believe?" None of them. Fucking none of them. You know what I mean? Like, come on. It's, you know what I mean? It's like, learn how to read a newspaper. But but I didn't, like I say, I just felt like I withdrew for like a really long time. And then I got to the point where I was like, okay, I have something to say again. I'm not the kind of person that feels like everybody needs to listen to what the fuck I have to say. I don't need to hear my own voice that much. You know what I mean? I'm honestly never somebody. I had a TV show. I never wanted to have a TV show. It was offered to me. There was money behind it. I said, yes, that sounds like a good idea. But it wasn't like I was like, that was my ambition.
Right.
But it was fun. It was great. I'm glad I did it. But I'm saying, like, I didn't necessarily have anything to say after those 16 episodes of that show. So now I feel like, I've had a chance to 20 years to recharge my batteries, haven't I? But I feel like I have something to say again. And so that's what I'm trying to get across in Magic Show. And again, it's this idea of, it's kind of a master class where there's a large conversation, over 55 people, and they're talking about magic, giving different perspectives about magic. And it's kind of a master class in that way. It's, and it's made for people who are not skeptical about this stuff. It's also made for people who might be skeptical about this, but have an open mind and would watch it and say, these people are making sense. Because that's the thing, right? You think that if you were to interview 55 people on the occult, that a lot of them would just say completely nuts shit and just be like a bunch of woo-woos. No one did. Not one person did. Not one person. Okay, there's 60 hours of footage and not one person says something stupid.
Right.
Think about that. And that's a pretty right. And so that's what I'm working with. And I think that's this, when this goes out, people are going to really respond to it in that way. They're going to find somebody in amongst that group is going to really appeal to them, and it's going to open their mind up to what magic could be, and it's going to change their life.
Yeah. I just want to list some people. Douglas Rushkoff takes part. Grant Morrison, comic book writer. Christina Oakley Harrington, owner of Treadwell's, and just had them on the podcast talking about Wicca. Wonderful. I swear,
she's great. Christina is fantastic.
I love her. I love her with all my heart. Yeah.
She's a really very articulate person. She knows her shit. I mean, she was, aside from Treadwell, she was the editor of Abraxas magazine.
That's right. That's right.
She has a deep knowledge of this kind of stuff, and she was phenomenal on camera. Phenomenal. Yeah. And also, she was incredibly helpful with introducing me to other people in London.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. I just had the I was able to talk at Treadwell's over the summer. It was great. We got on like a house on fire. But I guarantee everybody, there'll be links in the show notes. Head to Magic Show and see. There's going to be somebody there. You're like, Kenneth Anger. Last interview with Kenneth Anger. Yeah. I guarantee you, there's going to be somebody there that you will be interested by. So I have to ask you, Richard, how do people who at this point, because unfortunately this show's coming out after the Kickstarter is over, how can folks?
It's long over.
How do people who are listening to the show, how do they engage with Magic Show? Can they still take part in the deliciousness of it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, here's the thing, right? So there's 4 episodes, and the way that this was done, it's like a lot of the Kickstarter money is like it's already sunk cost. I got to pay somebody back who, so it's not like it's all going to like new production, right? Yeah. But so the idea was, if we would have been able to raise like 150, I would have been able to finish all 4 shows. But it would be very, because it's not just hiring an editor, you have to hire a color grader, you have to hire an audio person, all this kind of stuff. And that's, there's real hard costs that are associated with that, right? And so there's 2 of them that we raised enough money to do 2 of them and then some. But those 2 episodes are going to come. You ask how people could get involved with it. It's the Kickstarter is still there. Okay. We're still trying to raise money to finish those last 2. I've got in the case of the last ones, there's pieces on Austin Spare, on Marjorie Cameron, on Kenneth Anger, William Burroughs, Chaos Magic, and a sort of a piece about the black magic of the Russian troll farms and how that sort of thing works. Because my thesis is that black magic, the definition of black magic, is causing harm to your enemies from a distance, and this is what the Russians are doing,
right?
Yeah. So that's what it is. So so yes, people could go there and they can still. It's still the doors are still open.
Still open. Okay.
Back it if they wish to. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you.
There's a really cool poster and stuff like that. So
definitely, I will have links for all of that in the show notes. Richard, what's next for you? You teased a little bit of a book. Am I able to tease a little bit more about that book? What's happening with that?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you asked. Okay. So I'm doing all these podcasts, right, for the Kickstarter, and people would you don't want to say the same damn thing on every show, right? Because for the 3 or 4 people that are listening to every single podcast that I do, I don't want to bore them, right? I'm doing it for them. But anyway, so people would say to me like, oh, like, what's something, like, what's a weird story that's happened to you?
Right.
And I told a weird story that happened to me. Like, for the story I told you about the Cosmic Trigger book, right? So something like that, or these other things that have happened, and I started to realize, holy shit, it was like shaking loose these memories, right? All of this stuff that happened to me. It was 30 years ago. I had 29 years ago. I had a 3-year period where the most insane shit happened to me constantly. I mean, it was like more than once a week, something really nuts happened. And the kind of thing that, where it started to add up to something that was undeniably, as it were, someone fucking with me, something fucking with me. Okay. It had a sense of humor, which is how, right. It's the book that I'm writing, okay, is about that experience. So like I say, these podcasts were sort of shaking loose these memories that I had. And I began to think, God, how did I not think about this at the time? Like, and the answer is I was busy. The honest to God thing is I was busy. Life just kept moving at a breakneck speed at that time in my life. So it was like one weird thing happened, and then the next week another weird thing would happen, and then another, and then so I kept moving forward with my life, and I never reflected on these things until 29 years later. I have the reason to think about it, and I said, like, holy fucking shit, this would make a really good book.
Yeah.
Right. So I am writing a book which is, in a sense, a kind of a cosmic trigger of my own in that way, because and the thing about it is it does acknowledge that it is self-consciously that, okay? But what I'm trying to do is write a book that honestly is as honest about what happened to me as what happened to Bob. I've told him that story that will tell in this book. The crux of the thing is that I've written I'm 55 pages into it already, right? 51 pages. And it's the story. It's this sort of, like I say, it starts to add up into something really, really crazy. And I'll just leave you with this. The thing that is really one of the things that's really inspired this book, and that I want to use as kind of a frontispiece to this, is there's a 2-paragraph thing that's in what Aleister Crowley's diaries, The Magical Record of the Great Beast. I think it takes like 1916. So it's when he's in America. He's saying this, and he's writing about how he had been to speaking to a guy who had run this like psychic, society, a psychical event society or something like that. And he said to the guy, like, your research proves that this kind of energy exists, undoubtedly. But what I can prove to you, via his diaries, is that it can also arrange things like a military campaign to happen in such a way as to send messages that it is communicating with you in that way. And I thought, well, that's
what you're doing.
The perfect way to start this book off.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, it's like this thing, and I think that what will happen is, in my case, like Bob Wilson's very honest about what's happening. In my case, the honesty that has to come from my point of view is that I'm the Mr. Magoo of magic. Is that I went through all of this shit, none of it. I mean, I was in the weirdest situations, and I would walk away completely unscathed,
right,
like a cartoon character, right? And now that I am actually vision impaired, I really relate to Mr. Magoo.
Yeah.
That's what I start to realize is like, man, I was fucking dense. How did it take me 30 years to realize, wow, something that happened to me? This is like, I mean, it's a story. I'm not gonna bore you with the story right now. You can read the book, but it really is a fairly epic chain of events. And I went into, the Perplexity search engine, right? The AI search engine, Perplexity. I went into it and I said, if this happens, what are the odds against this happening? And it'll just, within seconds, it'll just spit out, well, the chances of that happening are 1 within 500,000. And then that other one would also be 1 within, and then the third thing would be 1. And if you add them all up, and basically it was saying that this literally one event that I'm writing about in this book, literally one event, it would be 1 in 32 to a factor of 10.
That's a lot of zeros.
Okay. Right, exactly. And then it was weird too because my friend Brad, I told him about this, and he'd lived through all this experience with me, and he remembered all of this with his razor sharp memory. And he said, "But you know the thing is," he was like, "when you think about that, he's like, all of those people that were involved in your synchronicity, it's kind of like they're in the same tribe. It's like the same social circles." He's like, you're talking about people who like either wrote for magazines or they might be in magazines, and like you're seeing these synchronicities in media and stuff like that. And I said, "But Brad, even if you gave it a discount of 90% for the fact that these tribes, right? Similar social circles, it still doesn't." He's like, yeah.
Astronomical
He's like,
still.
yeah, he's like, yeah, you're right. You're right. Okay, forget it. That's what this book is going to be about, and I'm having a great deal of fun writing it. I think it'll appeal especially to you because you like Cosmic Trigger so much. Because, like I say, self-consciously writing that version of that. So
amazing! Can't wait. Is there a time when you'd like to have it in the can, or is it just a TBA?
Well, I'm 51 pages in. You know what I mean? And so but the crux of it is that, and then the rest of it is going to be an exploration of that. I'm thinking about, in a sense, writing to people who are quantum physicists or who write about synchronicities. So anybody from like New Age writers to like scientists, I'm going to write to them and say, "What do you think about this?" Yeah. Right. And I did actually send it to one guy already, and it's Dr. Bernard Beitman, if you know who that is. He's a Yale trained psychologist. He's retired now, and he runs something I think it's called the Coincidence Project. Okay. And so that's what he does. And he wrote a really amazing book about synchronicities and how you can sort of categorize them. So it's not like a woo-woo book in any way. It's like a book of how to categorize these experiences in a scientific sense, and acknowledging that this is happening all over the world to a lot of different people. I sent it to him, and he wrote back and he said, "This is like a 1 in a million story." He was like, "I've never heard a story like this," and that's what Bob said as well when I told him. He's like, "I've never heard a story like that before." Yeah. So there you go.
Amazing. Richard, where can people find you on the internet these days? Are you trying to remain a little bit hidden? Do you have, are you on the Instagram, or are you on the...
I am on Instagram. Yeah. I mean, I got on Instagram because I had to do it for the Kickstarter, but yeah, I am on Instagram. People could find me there.
Amazing. Is there anywhere else on the internet that you'd like to direct people's attention, or just everybody head straight to the Kickstarter?
Well, magicshow.net. That's where they'll find the Kickstarter. Get them right to the Kickstarter page, magicshow.net. And, there's Dangerous Minds is still there, but it's not being updated as often as it used to be.
Right, for sure. I will have all of the appropriate links as to where to find Magic Show, as well as Richard's presence on Instagram. All of those things will be available on the show notes to this episode at whatmagicisthis.com. Not a ton of show notes for this show, but certainly if you want to see some of the books that we talked about on this episode, head there. Once again, whatmagicisthis.com. Do you think that I'm doing something kind of special here with the show and you would like to support me in some way, shape, or form? Just like every single episode, let us go through it. So there are 4 ways of supporting, 2 really big ones and 2 not as big, but still worth talking about. And I'll try to make this as short as I can, because I know these things just keep getting longer each and every time I do them. But let's try to keep it simple, shall we? So the first way of supporting me is the absolute best way. This is the thing that makes this my career. This is my job. This is my day job. This is what I do. I wake up, I work on the podcast, and then I do that 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and then I go to bed. Truly, the best way of supporting me is through Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click on any number of the support on Patreon buttons there. There's a lot of them because I really need your support because, again, this is my job. The Patreon support is only $7 a month. That is $7 American, which is, I don't know, $4,000 Canadian. Just joking, it's not that high, but $7 American a month, that is absolutely nothing. It gives you access to all kinds of things. Lots of audio episodes, lots of episodes about specific entities within magic, or saints, or angels, even demons. I'm currently working on an episode that has literally taken me 2 months to do on Michael, the Archangel Michael. So look out for that one. I do videos about how to do certain things within magic. Haven't done a video in a while. It's kind of Yeah, I wonder why people aren't voting for it. But that's another thing that you get for being a Patreon supporter is that you get to vote on the kind of things that I produce on the Patreon itself. I call them my offerings. Other people just say that's content. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that the Patreon is amazing. It's my favorite work. Truly, I enjoy doing this main podcast, but I absolutely love doing my Patreon stuff because you get to see more of the things that I really find interesting within magic. It's like a whole different podcast, and it's only $7 a month. And truly, if you like this that I'm doing here on this show, and you want to support me and you want to see something completely different that is also cool and just so much more than this main podcast, please see your way to supporting me on Patreon. Once again, that is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com. Click on any number of the buttons. If you pay for 1 month, you get access to a Discord server for life. So if you give me that $7 just once, you can get onto a whole amazing Discord community that is very active. Everybody's very kind there. It's the nicest place on the internet right now. Truly, the money that you spend supporting me every month goes so far to giving you so much. And there's only one tier. And so if you want to support me, please see your way to supporting me through Patreon. That is the best way of doing so. Also, I've got PayPal. Head to whatmagicisthis.com. Click the PayPal button. You know, the two P's, they're blue and the other one's kind of blue. And then, you can send me $5, $10, $20, $2, $2 to $200,000. Any amount helps. It just keeps this podcast running. It's a bit expensive, and that money comes right out of my pocket. So if you donate through the PayPal, that just keeps this podcast seemingly ad-free, right? Because who likes ads? I hate them. I truly do. But I would love any amount of money through the PayPal. It just keeps this podcast going. Third way of helping support me is another great way of supporting me, and it also helps you yourself. So we talked about some books in this episode: Cosmic Trigger, the Eric Davis book, High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the 70s, and many other books. And say you want to go grab this book. You're like, that sounds interesting. I would love to grab that. Well, guess what? I have a virtual bookshop. It is done through bookshop.org, which means that when you order a book from my website, or you head to the actual URL or bookshop.org/shop/whatmagicisthis, and you grab the book, what it does is that some of the money goes to help the bookshop that you bought it from, and these are independent bookshops. These are not run by Omnicorp or any other major organization. But what also happens is that because this is an affiliate bookshop, I get like $1 or $2 as well. So if you want to support local bookstores and you want to support me as well, I would love to see you grab any one of the books we talked about today, because they're really, really good. And that helps just more than yourself who gets the book, right? It helps me because I do make a lot of suggestions for books, and it helps an independent bookshop. So 2 ways of finding this bookshop. First one, again, is the URL, bookshop.org/shop/whatmagicisthis, all one word, obviously, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click on any number of the virtual bookshop links. You'll see them there. They're at the bottom of the page. They're in the menu. They're everywhere. Or head to the episode website, the specific episode website for What Magic Is This, for each and every episode. And I have all of the links there to most of the books I talk about in those episode show notes. Click that, and you'll be able to buy the book that you clicked on. And then it helps me, and it helps the independent booksellers. So that's a great way of supporting me as well. We all love books. Books are truly one of the major reasons that we're here. Without books, we would not be talking about Robert Anton Wilson today, truly. And they're so important to everybody. And let's help out some people, myself included, obviously, when grabbing some books, because we all need a little bit of help from time to time, and books have given us so much. And the last way of showing your support for me is buying some merchandise. I don't see a ton of money from these, but I do love seeing people wearing them. Honestly, it's awesome. Somebody last week showed me a picture of them wearing a t-shirt. It's so cool. I love when people grab merchandise. So do you want some mugs? Do you want t-shirts? Do you want hoodies? Do you want fridge magnets? Do you want stickers? Do you want tote bags? I just literally ordered a tote bag for myself. No joke. I am my favorite and best customer because I do make the things. But there's some really cool designs there. How to find it, head to whatmagicisthis.com. Go to the menu there in the top right. Click that, and it'll say merchandise. Head there. It's run through TeePublic. Again, don't see a ton of money from it, but I love watching people. Yes, I'm actively watching you. I'm watching you. Putting my shirt on. Oh, yeah. Looks good. Does it feel good? Certainly does. Why don't you go outside? Take a little walk down the street. Try and see if a stranger will ask you, hey, what magic is this? And you'll say, it's a great podcast. Check it out. And then you're going to have a great day. That's what happens when I watch you put on a shirt. Anyhow, I would love to see you with a picture of yourself wearing my merchandise, having a sip from your What Magic Is This coffee mug. It's all amazing. But that merchandise, again, not the greatest way of supporting me financially, but I just love to see it. All of these things, all of the show notes, all of the Patreon links, the PayPal links, the link to my virtual bookshop, as well as to my merchandise store, are available at whatmagicisthis.com. Please see your way to checking it out. Richard, I'm going to do it for a third time. Thank you so much for the things you did. Truly.
Oh, I've had a blast talking to you, and the things that you've said to me are so sweet and so complimentary. I cannot thank you enough because you've really made my day to tell me this.
Oh no, it's you.
I mean, you're talking about my life's work. I mean,
you've made my life.
Likes it. I like that too. You
know. Oh my gosh, everybody! This has been such a fantastic. This has been a birthday gift for myself. Unlike any other, Richard, I'm so glad that I had a chance to actually share words with you. Your work meant the world to me. It changed everything. And for that, I am eternally grateful. And I will speak for the people that listen to my podcast and love the show, the 70,000 of them that tune in every month.
That's a big audience.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, no.
Congratulations. That's hard to do.
Thank you. No, they thank you as well, Richard. I think
that's a football stadium full of people that you're
talking. There you go. I hope so. I hope so. But thank you for everything. Truly, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. And I would hope that if at some point, a little bit further up on the road, if you wanted to come back on What Magic Is This, you'd be able to.
Anytime. Please keep in touch.
Amazing. Well, everybody, that is the show. We're going to talk. We just talked a little bit more about Robert Anton Wilson, one of our favorite people in the world. That's all we've got. So please head to magicshow.net. Find Richard all of the places that you can. Please support if you can. Magic Show looks to be scrumptious and toothsome. But until then, next time, everybody, we'll talk about more of this crazy time loopy, reality tunneled, weird, wacky thing we call magic and the occult. Until then, next time, everybody, stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. And we'll talk to you soon. Goodbye, everybody. Ta-ta.